I had always believed I knew where I belonged in my family, not because anyone ever said it out loud, but because for most of my life, my place felt obvious. I was the constant, the one who showed up early and left last, the one who remembered birthdays without reminders, who kept documents in labeled folders, who knew where everything was when everyone else panicked. I am 76 years old, born and raised in New York City, back when the city felt louder, but somehow more human. I grew up in Brooklyn, in a narrow apartment where the walls were thin and privacy didn't exist, but love did. My parents were immigrants who believed stability was built through sacrifice. You worked, you saved, you stayed loyal. That was how you proved your worth. I carried that belief into my own marriage. I married young, too young, some said. But we built a life anyway. 2 children, long work days, short vacations, careful planning. I worked for decades as a bookkeeper in a garment factory, balancing numbers while machines rattled around me and women shared their lives in fragments between shifts. I learned to be dependable, invisible when necessary, strong when required. When my husband died, far earlier than anyone expected, I didn't fall apart. I adjusted. I always adjusted. That's what women like me were taught to do. You grieve quietly. You keep going. You become the foundation everyone assumes will always be there. The apartment I live in now is on the Upper West Side. Not luxurious, but paid for. Every inch of it carries a memory. Photos on shelves, old letters in drawers, dishes I only use on holidays. I live alone, but I never considered myself lonely. My life felt full, orderly, earned. My son lives in Connecticut, my daughter on Long Island. They have families of their own now, busy lives, tight schedules, everything planned weeks in advance. We spoke regularly, though the conversations had changed over the years. Shorter, more efficient, less curious. And then there is my granddaughter, Emily. She's 28 years old, intelligent, ambitious, beautiful in the effortless way youth allows. I helped raise her in ways no one ever really counts. Babysitting when her parents worked late, covering school expenses when things were tight, showing up to recitals, graduations, quiet moments no one photographed. When she was little, she slept in my bed during sleepovers and whispered secrets into the dark. When she was a teenager, she called me before she called her mother when our heart broke for the first time. When she moved into her first apartment in Manhattan, I helped furnish it, paid the deposit, bought the couch, stocked the fridge. I never kept track. Love doesn't keep score. That's why it took me longer than it should have to realize something was wrong. I heard about the engagement, of course. A quick phone call, cheerful, rushed. She's engaged, my son said. Very excited. Big wedding, lots of planning. I smiled into the phone. Asked when, asked where, asked how I could help. We'll let you know, he said. Things are moving fast. They always say that. Weeks passed, then months. No date on my calendar, no envelope on my table, no save-the-date magnet on my refrigerator, like every other family milestone had been. I told myself not to overthink it. Weddings are complicated. Young people get overwhelmed. I had lived long enough to know patience mattered. I found out about the wedding date by accident. I was at my daughter's house one afternoon, helping fold laundry while she rushed around preparing dinner. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't notice it. I did. A message lit up the screen. Emily's stressing about the guest list. The venue was already full. Guest list. I looked up. She set a date? I asked casually, keeping my voice light. My daughter froze. Just for a moment. Long enough for me to notice. Oh, yeah, she said. Didn't we tell you? No, they hadn't. When is it? I asked. She hesitated, then said it. June, Manhattan, a venue I knew well. Expensive, elegant, exclusive. And, am I going? I asked. She laughed, not cruelly, uncomfortably. Well, she said, avoiding my eyes, it's a small wedding. Small. Later, I would learn there were nearly 200 guests. Friends, colleagues, distant relatives, people I barely recognized when I eventually saw the photos. But not me. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, listening to the city outside my window, sirens in the distance, a bus braking at the corner, the familiar sound of a city that never stops moving forward, even when you feel left behind. I replayed moments from my life, every birthday card, every check slipped quietly into envelopes, every time I showed up without being asked. And a question surfaced that I couldn't push away. When did I become optional? The official explanation came days later. My son called. He spoke gently, carefully. "Emily's overwhelmed," he said. "She doesn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" I asked. "Well, your health, your age. The ceremony is long, loud music. We didn't want you to feel out of place." Out of place. At my granddaughter's wedding. In the city where I built my entire life. I didn't argue. I didn't cry on the phone. I said what women like me are conditioned to say. "I understand." But I didn't. What they didn't realize was that the exclusion wasn't just about a wedding. It was about everything they assumed I no longer deserved access to. And as I sat alone that night, the city humming outside, one quiet truth settled in my chest. They had decided my life was already finished. And they were wrong. After the phone call with my son ended, I sat very still at the small kitchen table, my hands folded one over the other, staring at a faint crack in the wall I had never noticed before. It ran from the corner of the window frame down toward the radiator, thin and uneven, like something that had been there a long time but only revealed itself when you finally slowed down enough to look. That was how everything felt now, as if my life had developed fractures, quietly, politely, while I was busy believing I still belonged. I did not cry right away. Women of my generation were taught to save tears for moments when no one could mistake them for weakness. Instead, I made tea. I rinsed the cup before filling the kettle, even though it was already clean. I moved slowly, deliberately, as though my body needed proof that I still existed in space. When I finally sat down again, the tea went untouched. My thoughts were louder than any appetite. I replaced the word small in my mind. Small wedding, small list, small expectations, small space for me. Yet nothing about the event itself was small. Over the following days, details surfaced effortlessly, as if the world assumed I already knew them. A florist delivery van parked on my street with the venue's name printed in elegant script. A neighbor mentioned seeing a post online about the society wedding of the season. An old coworker called to ask if I was excited to see my granddaughter walk down the aisle. Each time I smiled. Each time I redirected the conversation. And each time I felt the same sharp awareness settle deeper into my chest. No one had been instructed to protect me from this knowledge. My absence wasn't being hidden. It was being normalized. One afternoon, I opened my computer and searched the venue. I don't know why. Curiosity, perhaps, or masochism. The photos loaded slowly. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, long banquet tables set with gold-rimmed plates. Everything about it spoke of permanence, status, arrival, the kind of place you choose when you want the world to witness that you've made it. I imagined the guest list being drafted, names debated, seats assigned, decisions made with care, and at no point, apparently, did anyone say, "What about her?" That realization hurt more than the exclusion itself. I thought about Emily then, not as a bride, not as a grown woman, but as the child who used to sit cross-legged on my living room rug, braiding my hair with clumsy fingers while telling me her dreams. I remembered the night she called me crying because she'd failed an exam, convinced she'd ruined her future. I stayed on the phone with her for 3 hours, reminding her that one moment never defines a life. Where was that girl now? The answer came slowly, and it was uncomfortable. She hadn't disappeared. She had outgrown the version of me that served her needs, and I had let that happen. As the wedding approached, the distance became louder. My son stopped calling entirely. My daughter sent one polite text asking if I was doing okay. I replied yes, because that was what was expected, because older women are supposed to be fine with less. Less attention, less inclusion, less relevance. But something inside me had begun to resist that narrative. Late one night, unable to sleep, I pulled out a small box from the back of my closet. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years, deeds, insurance policies, account statements, handwritten notes from my husband explaining decisions he'd made just in case. We had always planned carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for what we'd built. I spread the papers across the table and studied them in the quiet glow of a single lamp. Everything was orderly, thoughtful, intentional. And suddenly, a truth became impossible to ignore. I had been excluded from the wedding not because I was incapable, but because I was inconvenient. My presence complicated the image. My age disrupted the aesthetic. My history reminded them that nothing they had came from nowhere. That kind of reminder makes people uncomfortable. The night before the wedding, the city felt unusually loud. Sirens echoed longer. Footsteps outside my window sounded hurried, purposeful, like everyone was moving towards something I wasn't meant to see. I stood at the window for a long time, watching taxis pass, couples laughing on the sidewalk, women my age walking dogs or carrying groceries, invisible to everyone except themselves. I wondered how many of them had stories like mine, how many had been quietly removed from moments they helped make possible. When the morning came, I did not mark it in any way. No black dress, no morning ritual. I went for a walk instead, farther than usual, letting my legs remind me that they were still strong. I passed a church where bells rang joyfully. I passed a florist arranging white roses. I passed a bridal shop with mannequins frozen mid-celebration. I felt oddly calm. That afternoon, my phone buzzed once. A single photo appeared on the family group chat. Emily, radiant and white, smiling beneath a cascade of flowers. The caption was simple: "We did it." I looked at the image for a long time. Then I set the phone down, face first, on the table. And that was the moment everything changed.
Less attention, less inclusion, less relevance.
I did not confront anyone. I simply stopped reaching, and in that silence, something unexpected happened. Nothing collapsed. The world did not end because I wasn't calling. No one came rushing to check on me. No one noticed the absence of my voice. And that, more than anything, confirmed what I had already begun to understand. I had been holding the family together far more than they realized. Without me smoothing conversations, without me filling gaps, without me reminding people to care, the connections loosened almost immediately. The group chat went quiet. The obligatory check-in text disappeared. Days passed without a single message. At first, the stillness hurt. Then it clarified. I filled my time deliberately. I returned to routines I had neglected. Morning walks along the river, lunch at the small cafe on Amsterdam Avenue where the owners still knew my name, evenings spent reading books I'd bought years ago but never opened because I was always too busy being available. And slowly, in the absence of distraction, I began to see the pattern of my life with sharper focus.
I had always been the one who gave without asking, who anticipated needs before they were voiced, who offered support quietly so no one would feel indebted. I had believed that was love. But love without boundaries doesn't stay love. It becomes expectation, then entitlement, then erasure. One afternoon, I received an email from my son. Not a call, an email. It was short, polite, carefully worded. "Mom, just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing well. Wedding went beautifully. We'll send photos soon." I stared at the screen for a long time. No acknowledgement, no apology, no curiosity about how I might have felt. Just a report, like an update sent to someone on the periphery. I closed the laptop. That evening, I pulled out the same box of documents again, not out of anger, but out of intention. I reviewed everything slowly. Accounts, beneficiaries, powers of attorney, decisions my husband and I had made years ago, assuming circumstances that no longer existed. At the time, we had believed closeness was permanent, that family roles never shifted. We were wrong. As I read, a realization surfaced with unsettling clarity. Every safeguard in my life had been built on an assumption that the people closest to me would always act in my best interest. But assumptions are fragile things, and mine had already cracked. I made an appointment with an estate attorney the following week. I told no one, not because I was hiding, but because I was finally choosing privacy over performance. The attorney was a woman younger than my children, with calm eyes and a voice that didn't rush me. She listened as I spoke, about the wedding, the exclusion, the gradual distance, the quiet assumptions made about my relevance. When I finished, she didn't look shocked. She looked familiar with the story. "This happens more often than people think," she said gently.
Especially to women your age. That sentence landed heavier than anything else. Especially to women your age. She reviewed my documents carefully, then looked up. "You're still fully capable. Your records are immaculate. There's no legal reason for anyone else to be making decisions on your behalf." "I know," I said. She nodded. "Then the question isn't whether you can change things, it's whether you want to." I thought of the wedding photos I had never received, the invitations that never came, the silence that followed. "I do," I said. Over the next hour, we made changes. Not dramatic ones, thoughtful ones. I updated beneficiaries, reassigned responsibilities, removed assumptions that no longer reflected reality. I didn't erase my family from my life. I simply stopped positioning them at the center of decisions they no longer treated with respect. When I left the office, the city felt different. Not warmer, not kinder, but more honest. I walked several blocks before realizing my shoulders were no longer tense. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The shift became noticeable in subtle ways. My son called 2 days later, his voice tentative. "Mom, everything okay?" "Yes," I said. And it was true. There was a pause. He waited for more. I gave none. "Well," he continued, uncertain, "we were thinking of stopping by next weekend." I considered the invitation, not emotionally, but clearly. "Let me know closer to the day," I replied. "I may have plans." Another pause. Longer this time. "Oh, okay." After we hung up, I sat quietly, absorbing the unfamiliar feeling of not rearranging my life to remain convenient. I realized then that reclaiming yourself doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like no longer filling silence for others, like allowing people to feel the absence of what they took for granted. And as the days went on, something shifted in how my family spoke to me. Not kinder, not warmer, more careful. They asked instead of assumed, waited instead of expected, listened, if only because they sensed something had changed and they didn't yet understand how. They would, but not yet, because the final change, the one that would truly alter everything, was still coming. And when it did, it wouldn't announce itself loudly. It would arrive the way all real consequences do. Quietly, inevitably, and long overdue. I did not tell anyone what I was doing. That was the first real change. For most of my life, every decision I made had been shaped by other people's needs, expectations, or comfort. I explained myself. I softened my choices. I asked permission even when none was required. But after the wedding day passed without me, something fundamental shifted. Silence became my ally. Privacy became power. The morning after the wedding, I woke early, as I always did. The city looked the same from my window. Buses groaning at the corner, steam rising from subway grates, the faint echo of a radio somewhere below. But I felt different inside it, lighter. Not because I wasn't hurt,
but because I had stopped waiting. I made coffee and sat at the table with the notebook I had opened the night before. The sentence at the top of the page stared back at me. I will not disappear quietly. Below it, I began to write. Not emotions, facts. Accounts, properties, beneficiaries, trusts, signatures. I had spent my life managing numbers for other people. Payrolls, ledgers, balances that never forgave mistakes. And yet somehow I had avoided looking directly at my own affairs. Not because I was incapable, but because I trusted that the people I loved would never turn my preparation against me. Trust is a powerful thing. So is misplaced trust. By mid-morning, I had organized everything in clean, labeled folders. Nothing new, nothing dramatic, just clarity. The kind that reveals how much control you still have when no one is distracting you. That afternoon, I called an attorney. Not the one my son had once suggested for convenience, not a family friend. I chose a woman whose voice was calm, measured, unimpressed by sentimentality. She listened while I explained the exclusion, the silence, the assumptions. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she said only one thing. You're not describing abandonment, she said. You're describing erasure. And the law does not favor people who erase witnesses to their own history. We scheduled a meeting. Walking into her office a few days later, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Not fear, not guilt. Anticipation. We talked for hours. I explained my family structure, my assets, the ways I had supported my children over the years, financially, emotionally, quietly. I told her about the apartment, the accounts, the documents my husband had prepared before he died. I told her about the wedding, but only briefly. By then, it felt less like a wound and more like evidence. She took notes, asked precise questions, and then leaned back in her chair. Do you know what your family expects? She asked. Yes, I said. They expect me to stay the same. She nodded. Then the most effective response is to change everything that requires their participation. The next few weeks unfolded quietly, almost mundanely, but beneath the surface, everything was being rearranged. I revised my will. Not in anger, not in haste, but with intention. I removed assumptions. I removed vague language. I removed the idea that blood alone entitled anyone to access or inheritance. I created a trust that reflected my values: education, responsibility, accountability. I ensured that any future support would require communication, presence, respect. I made sure that nothing would happen automatically ever again. Then came the bank.
I walked into my branch on a Tuesday morning, dressed neatly, carrying a folder that held my entire life in paper form. The young man at the counter smiled politely, the way people do when they assume you'll need help understanding something simple. I'd like to speak with someone about restructuring my accounts, I said. His smile flickered. Of course, he replied, already reaching for a brochure. No brochures, I said calmly. I need access removed, permissions revoked, signatures updated. He paused, then nodded, suddenly more attentive. An hour later, every joint account was closed, every secondary signer removed, automatic transfers canceled, new security measures put in place. When he asked if anyone else should be notified, I said no. My finances, I told him, are no longer a family matter. The words felt solid in my mouth. Then came the phone calls, not to my children, to myself. I began doing things I had postponed for years because someone else's schedule always mattered more. I joined a lecture series at the library. I signed up for a walking group. I started meeting a friend for coffee every Thursday, a woman who, like me, had been quietly sidelined by her own family and was learning late in life how much space she still deserved. And slowly, the silence from my children broke. My daughter called first. Her voice was careful, curious. Mom, she said, are you okay? You've been distant. I smiled to myself. I've been busy, I replied. With what? With my life. She didn't know how to respond to that. My son called next, more direct, less patient. I heard you changed some things, he said. The bank said, the bank speaks to me now, I said, not to you. A pause. Why didn't you tell us? He asked. I considered the question carefully. Why didn't you tell me I wasn't invited to the wedding? I asked. Silence. I thought so, I said gently, and ended the call. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic rupture, just consequences.
Weeks later, Emily called. Her voice was softer than I remembered, less certain. "Grandma," she said, "why didn't you come?" I closed my eyes. "You didn't invite me," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. I thought it would be awkward," she said. "Everyone said you'd understand." "I understand perfectly," I said. "I understand that I was considered optional." "That's not what I meant," she whispered. "But it's what you decided, and decisions have weight." She cried then. I let her. I did not rush to comfort her, not because I didn't love her, but because love without boundaries teaches nothing. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small. "I didn't think you'd do all this." I looked around my apartment, at the photos, the documents, the life I had protected. Neither did I. After that call, something settled into place.
They had expected me to absorb the hurt quietly, to return to my role unchanged, grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion came my way next. Instead, I had stepped aside, and in doing so, I had forced them to finally see the shape of the space I once occupied. But the truth was already clear. When you exclude someone long enough, you teach them how to live without you. And sometimes that is the most powerful lesson of all. The weeks after the wedding passed quietly, too quietly for a family that had once filled every corner of my life with noise, demands, and expectations. The group chat went silent. No photos, no updates, no casual calls. It was as if the celebration had consumed all remaining obligation, leaving nothing behind. And for the first time, I did not chase the silence. I woke each morning to the familiar sounds of the city, delivery trucks groaning to a stop, the muffled voices of neighbors through thin walls, the distant rumble of the subway beneath my feet. Life went on. My life went on. And slowly, something unexpected happened. I began to feel lighter. Not happier, not yet, but clearer. The fog that had hung over my thoughts for months began to lift, revealing something I hadn't examined in years. Myself, separate from my role in their lives. I took longer walks, sat in cafes without checking my phone, read books cover to cover instead of skimming headlines while waiting for calls that never came. I noticed how often I had lived in anticipation of birthdays, holidays, needs that weren't my own. One afternoon, while organizing a drawer I had avoided for years, I found a folder labeled in my husband's handwriting, estate planning. I sat on the floor and opened it, letting the papers spill out around me like a map I had forgotten I possessed. Everything was there: the apartment, the accounts, the investments, the beneficiaries. Names that had once felt obvious. Now they felt assumed. I spent hours reading every page, not with fear, but with curiosity, with the same precision I had used my entire life when balancing ledgers and correcting mistakes no one else caught. And in that process, another truth surfaced, one that had been there all along. They hadn't just excluded me from the wedding. They had already excluded me from their vision of the future. My value to them had been practical, financial, conditional, and now that I was inconvenient, I had been quietly removed from the picture. That realization did not break me. It steadied me. I scheduled an appointment with my attorney the following week, not in anger, not in secrecy, but with intention. He listened without interruption as I explained everything: the wedding, the silence, the years of assumption. When I finished, he folded his hands and said something that settled deep into my bones. "You're allowed to decide who benefits from your life," he said, "even now, especially now." We revised everything: beneficiaries, trusts, conditions. Not as punishment, not as revenge, as alignment. I ensured my assets would go toward causes that reflected the values I had lived by: education funds, women's support programs, scholarships for children of immigrants like my parents once were. I left something modest for my children, enough to avoid claims of cruelty, but not enough to reward disregard. And then, quietly, deliberately, I signed my name. When I left the office that day, the city felt different. Not because it had changed,
but because I had. Weeks later, my son called. His voice was uncertain, unfamiliar in its restraint. "Mom, we heard you made some changes." "Yes," I said calmly. A pause. "You didn't tell us." "I didn't know I needed permission," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. "We just thought," he began, then stopped. "We didn't realize you felt so pushed out." I considered that. "You didn't ask how I felt," I said. "You decided for me." Silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Not reconciliation, not yet, but recognition. The door hadn't closed forever, but it had closed firmly. Months later, Emily called. Her voice was softer than I remembered. "I didn't know," she said. I should have known. I didn't absolve her. I didn't accuse her. I simply told the truth. "You didn't see me," I said. "And when people stop seeing you, they stop valuing you." She cried. I listened. That was enough. Today, I still live in the same apartment. The photos are still on the shelves. The city still hums outside my window. But something essential has changed. I no longer measure my worth by my access to other people's milestones. I no longer wait to be included. I choose where I stand. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt quietly erased, not through cruelty, but through indifference, hear me clearly. Exclusion is a message, and you are allowed to respond. You do not have to disappear. You do not have to beg. You do not have to remain available to people who treat your presence as optional. Sometimes, changing everything doesn't require a confrontation. Sometimes, it requires a decision. And sometimes, the most powerful seat you can take is the one you choose for yourself. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories of quiet strength, difficult truths, and women who refuse to fade away, consider subscribing. Because being left out is often the beginning of finally stepping into your own life.